I turned the phone face down. It was a simple gesture. No one was watching. No one would know. But I knew. And it was as if inte a second something had startled. And for a long time, I thought that this age would bring answers. I thought that, as the years went by, things would become clearer. That I would know exactly what to expect from people, from life, from myself. But it's not like that. Some things just become quieter. And silence, I discovered too late, is also an answer. Before we begin, if this type of story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be notified whenever a new narrative like this is shared here. These are simple, human stories, meant to be listened to calmly perhaps when you need them most. For years, my cell phone was my companion, not because I spent the day using it, but because it represented something greater. Possibility. The possibility that someone would remember me. That my daughter would send a message asking how I was. That my son would call just to chat, without hurry, without reason. That my grandchildren would send a random photo, one of those silly ones, just to say hi. Grandma, I always left the volume at maximum. Even when I went to sleep, even when I went to the bakery, I didn't want to miss anything. I didn't want anyone to think I wasn't available. Because I always was. Always. My routine was predictable. I'd wake up early, make coffee, tidy the house, everything slowly, because there was no rush. And while I did all that, my cell phone would sit there on the kitchen table, screen facing up. I'd glance at it between tasks. Sometimes I'd unlock it just to make sure it was working, that the Wi-Fi was connected, that I hadn't missed anything. But there was almost never anything. I started to notice a pattern. On birthdays, messages always arrived. Happy birthday, Mom. I love you. A kiss, sometimes a quick audio message, sometimes just a heart emoji, and I would thank them. I always thanked them, as if that were enough, as if it were enough to fill the emptiness of the other 364 days. On Mother's Day, the same thing, loving messages, promises of a visit soon. See you soon, Mom, and I believed it. Or pretended to believe it, because it was easier than admitting that soon never came. There was a time when I took the initiative myself. I'd send a good morning message, ask how they were doing, say I missed them, and they'd reply, of course, always polite, always affectionate, but briefly, always briefly, everything's fine, Mom, and you? I'm fine, just feeling homesick. That's great. We can talk more later, okay? Bye. And that later never happened. I started noticing something strange. The more I reached out, the less they responded. The more I showed that I needed them, the more distant they seemed to become. And I didn't understand, because all I wanted was to be close, to be a part of it, to not be forgotten. But maybe I already was. Once, I called my daughter in the middle of the afternoon, just to hear her voice. She answered, but I could tell from her tone that she was busy. I said it wasn't anything important, that I just wanted to know how she was. She said everything was fine, but that she was leaving for a meeting, that she would call me later. She didn't call. And I didn't charge her because I was afraid. Afraid that if I charged her, she would distance herself even more. Afraid of seeming needy, afraid of being a burden. So I kept waiting, always waiting. My oldest grandson turned 18. I sent him a long message full of memories, saying how proud I was of him. He saw it, but he didn't reply. 3 days later, he posted a picture of the party. I didn't even know it had happened. I looked at that photo for a long time. He was happy, surrounded by friends. And I thought he didn't even notice I wasn't there. Or maybe he did notice. And it didn't make a difference. It was at that moment that something began to hurt in a different way. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment in the sense I knew it. It was something deeper. It was the slow, almost imperceptible realization that I was living in expectation of people who were no longer waiting for me. And even so, I continued. I kept texting. I kept calling. I kept showing that I was there, available, ready for anything. Because I thought that if I stopped, they would forget about me altogether. But I was already being forgotten. And it was on an ordinary day, with nothing special happening, that something changed inside me. I was sitting in another funny the Good Morning group chat. I had already typed it. I had already chosen the emoji. But before pressing send, I stopped and I asked myself, why am I doing this? It wasn't an innocent question. It was a real question, painful, honest, and the answer came slowly, like a weight settling in my chest. Because I'm afraid that, if I don't do it, nobody will remember I exist. I deleted the message, and I turned the phone face down. I stood there, staring at that object that had become the center of my life, a small rectangle of glass and metal that held all my hopes, all my frustrations, all my fear of being forgotten. And for the first time, he was upside down, invisible, silent, and I didn't know if that was relief or despair. I got up and went to make coffee. My hands were trembling a little, not from the cold, but from a strange feeling, as if I had just done something forbidden, something I shouldn't have done. But what, exactly, had I done? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And perhaps that was precisely what frightened me. Because for so long, doing nothing meant giving up. It meant accepting abandonment. It meant admitting that I wasn't important enough to fight for attention. But at that moment, sitting at the kitchen table, holding my coffee cup in both hands, I began to wonder, was fighting for attention really what I should be doing? I remembered when my children were little. I didn't have to fight for their attention. They were always there, always needing me. Mom, help me. Mom, look here. Mom, stay with me. And I was always there. But now they had grown up. They had their own lives, their own families, their own problems. And I was still there, hoping they would need me like before, hoping I would still be the center of attention. But I wasn't anymore. And accepting that hurt in a way I didn't know was possible. I finished my coffee in silence. The house was quiet. It always had been. But today the silence felt different. It felt heavier, as if it were waiting for me to do something, for me to react, for me to pick up my phone again and return to my usual routine. But I didn't do that. I washed the cup. Premier puitawa rim. The phone was still there, face down on the table, and I sat on the sofa, facing it, as if we were in a silent stalemate. How much of my life had I spent staring at that screen? How much time had I wasted waiting for it to light up, to vibrate, to show me that someone, somewhere, had thought of me? I didn't know, but I knew it was a lot. And he also knew that, somehow, this needed to stop. But how? How could I stop waiting when waiting had become my only occupation? How could I fill the void that would remain if I stopped looking at my phone every 5 minutes? I had no answer, but perhaps that was precisely the point. Perhaps I didn't need an answer. Perhaps I just needed to begin. Start what? I didn't know. But start. I picked up a book that had been on the shelf for months. A novel a friend had given me that I'd never had the courage to start. Because what if, just when I was reading, someone called? What if I missed the call because I was distracted? But now, sitting there with my phone face down, I opened the book and I started reading. The first few pages were difficult. My mind kept returning to my phone. Had I received a message? Had someone called and I hadn't heard? But I took a deep breath and I kept reading, and gradually the story began to captivate me. I started to care about the characters, about their lives, about their problems. And for a few minutes, I forgot about my cell phone. I forgot to wait. When I realized it, I had already read 30 pages. And the cell phone was still there, face down, silent, and I was fine. Or at least, that's what he was trying to be. I closed the book and looked out the window. The sun was beginning to set. In a few hours, it would be night. And I knew what came with the night: the heaviest loneliness, the deepest silence, the feeling that the whole world was together, with family, having dinner, talking, laughing, while I was there, alone in my empty house. But perhaps today could be different. Maybe tonight I wouldn't have to spend the whole night checking my phone, hoping someone would remember I exist. Perhaps today I could simplaus without just existing. I got up and went to the kitchen. I opened the refrigerator. There was some leftover chicken from lunch, some vegetables. I thought about making soup, something simple, something comforting. And while I was cooking, I realized I was humming, softly, an old song my husband liked. And for a moment, I felt his presence, not in a supernatural way, but in a real way, as if he were there, saying that everything was all right, that I was going to be all right, that I was always stronger than I imagined. The soup was ready. I put it in a deep bowl. I sat at the table, and I ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, and I didn't pick up my cell phone even once. When I finished, I washed the dishes. I tidied up the kitchen, and I went to my room. My cell phone was still in the living room, and for the first time in years, I was going to sleep without it beside me. I lay down on the bed. I turned off the light, and I closed my eyes, and I waited for the fear to come, the fear of being disconnected, of losing something important, of being forgotten forever. But the fear didn't come, or perhaps it did come, but in a different way, softer, more acceptable, and I fell asleep, not deeply, not without waking up a few times during the night. But I slept, and when I woke up the next morning, the first thing I thought about wasn't my cell phone. It was in the cafe I was going to make it. In the book I was going to continue reading on the day that was beginning. And that was different. This was new. And I didn't know if it was good or bad. But it was different. And perhaps being different was exactly what I needed. In the following days, that gesture was repeated. I would turn my phone face down, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because somehow I needed to stop looking. I needed to stop waiting. And it was strange, because for so long, my routine revolved around that object. Waking up and checking it, making lunch and checking it, watching television and checking it, sleeping with it beside me, always with the volume at maximum, always waiting for a sign that someone was thinking of me. But now, he just lay there, face down, silent, and the silence hurt. But in a different way, it wasn't the pain of their absence. It was the pain of realizing I had spent so much time waiting for something that would never come the way I imagined. I started noticing things that had previously gone unnoticed. The way I organized my entire day around the possibility of being called, of being remembered. I didn't schedule appointments. I didn't go for walks. I didn't visit that neighbor who always invited me for coffee. Because what if someone called? What if someone needed me? What if it was at that exact moment that my daughter decided to show up, but nobody showed up, and I remained there, standing, waiting, afternoon backing a cake, not for anyone in particular, just because I liked to. And in the middle of the recipe, I picked up my phone out of habit. I unlocked the screen. I looked at the notifications. Nothing. I put it back, face down, and I continued making the cake. It was a small moment, insignificant, but something inside me realized it. I had continued, even without a response, even without an audience. I had continued doing something that gave me pleasure, without needing anyone's validation. And it was liberating and terrifying at the same time. Because if I didn't need them to continue, what did that say about everything I had experienced up to that point? I began to realize there was a pattern in my life, a pattern I was feeding myself without realizing it. The more I made myself available, the more I was treated as something that was always there, always available, always waiting, and people, without malice, simply went on with their lives. Because they knew that, no matter what happened, I would be there. And I was, for years, for decades. But now, something was changing. I stopped sending good morning messages in the family group chat. I stopped calling for no reason. I stopped asking if everything was okay, not out of spite, not out of pride, but because I realized those messages weren't for them. They were for me. They were my way of silently shouting, "I'm still here. Please don't forget me." But they weren't forgetting me. They were just living. And I, instead of living too, was standing still, waiting. One Sunday my son called. It was unexpected. I answered, and he asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. He said he was worried because I hadn't texted him. And I, for the first time, was honest. I'm fine. I just realized that maybe I was texting too much. He laughed. He said no, that I could send whatever I wanted. But I knew it wasn't true. Because when I texted, he didn't reply. And now that he had called, I hung up the fat sud-west at White. I needed to get away to be found. And that made me sad. But it also made me understand something. I had spent my whole life believing that love was constant presence. It was always being available. It was never leaving anyone without an answer. But maybe love was also something else. Maybe it was giving space. Maybe it was trusting that, even without my daily message, they still loved me. But I didn't know how to do that. Because, for me, silence always meant abandonment. And perhaps that was why I was so afraid of being silent. I started going out more. Vailita the square. I sat on a bench and watched the people. Children playing, couples walking, elderly people chatting. And I noticed that nobody there knew who I was. Nobody expected anything from me. And somehow, that was comforting. I didn't need to be the mother, the grandmother, the person who is always available. I could just be me. I accepted my neighbor's invitation for coffee. Her name was Marcia. She was a widow, like me, and had lived alone for years. And when we entered her house, I noticed she had photos all over the living room. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I asked if they visited often. She smiled, a tired but serene smile. Not as much as I'd like, but I've learned that they have their lives. And I have mine. That touched me, because she didn't seem resentful. She didn't seem bitter. She just accepted it and lived. I returned home that day with a strange feeling in my chest. It wasn't happiness, but it wasn't sadness either. It was something in between, something I still couldn't name. I went a few days without turning my cell phone on. I left it in a drawer, and I confess it was difficult because I kept thinking, what if someone needs me? What if something happens? But nothing happened. Life went on. En première ointon. When I finally turned on the device, there were a few messages. My daughter asking if everything was okay. My son saying he was going to stop by on the weekend. My grandson sending some random meme, and I answered, but differently. Not with the same anxiety as before. Not with that fear that, if I delayed, they would give up on me. I simply replied, simple, calm, and I realized they continued talking to me in the same way. Nothing had changed for them, but everything had changed for me. I started noticing that. In moments when I wasn't expecting them, things happened more smoothly. My daughter would call. My son would show up, not because I had demanded it, not because I had begged for attention, but because, somehow, when I stopped pushing, they drew closer. And I didn't know if this was real or if I was just realizing what had always been there. But something was different, and I could feel it. I started doing things for myself, small things. I bought a book I'd wanted to read for ages. I started walking in the mornings before the sun got too hot. I tidied up the garden. I planted some flowers. And at no point during those times did I pick up my phone to record it, to show it, to prove that I was living. Premier July Ved. And it was liberating to realize that I didn't need witnesses for this to be real. One night, my daughter called me late. She was crying. She'd had a fight with her husband. She wanted to talk about it. And I listened, the way I always did. Butitim with everything. That I needed to fix everything to be useful, to be needed. I just listened. And when she hung up, I realized that was enough. I didn't need to do anything more. I didn't need to call the next day to see if she was feeling better. I didn't need to send constant supportive messages because she knew I was there. And when she needed me again, she would come back, and that wasn't abandonment. It was trust. But it took me 62 years to understand that. There was a day when I looked at the calendar and realized it had been 3 weeks since I'd last sent a message that wasn't in response to someone. 3 weeks in which I hadn't taken the initiative. I hadn't asked how they were doing. I hadn't sent a good morning message. I hadn't shared a recipe, a photo, a random thought just to keep in touch. And the world hadn't ended. They continued living. I continued living, and somehow the distance didn't seem any greater, perhaps because she had always been there, and I was only realizing it now. I started paying attention to the little things I did automatically, without questioning them, like how I always left the door unlocked when I knew a family member might come over, how I cooked large portions even though I lived alone, because you never know if someone will come for lunch. How I always left the guest room tidy, always ready, always waiting. But nobody came, and I kept preparing. I kept waiting, until one day I locked the door, not because I was angry, but because I realized that leaving everything open, always available, didn't make them come in anymore. It only made me never feel like my house was mine, that my time was mine. I was always on standby, always in standby mode, and that's tiring, even when we don't realize it. One afternoon I decided to reorganize the house. I started with the guest room. I removed the extra blankets, put away the towels that were always on display. I put my things there, my books, my sewing machine that had been sitting unused for years. I transformed that space into something of my own. And when I finished, I sat in the chair and looked around. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that this house wasn't just a place where I waited for others. It was a place where I could exist. I remembered when my husband was alive. The house was always full. Small children running around. Noise, mess, life. And after he was gone, the house became silent. And I spent years trying to fill that silence with the presence of others, even if it was only virtual, even if it was only through a message. But perhaps the silence didn't need to be filled. Perhaps it could simply be accepted. I began to realize that many of my expectations came from a different time. A time when families lived close by, when visits were frequent, when Sundays were sacred. But the world had changed. People had changed. And I showed the way things should be. And she suffered because reality never matched her expectations. My daughter worked far away. My son had 2 jobs. My grandchildren had their own lives, their own screens, their own worlds, and they weren't bad for it. They were just different, from a different generation, from a different time, and I needed to accept that. Otherwise, I would spend the rest of my life feeling abandoned by people who were, in reality, just living their lives. There was a Sunday when I woke up and, for the first time in years, I didn't feel that tightness in my chest. That anxiety that no one would call. That no one would remember me. I woke up and made my coffee. I sat on the porch. I listened to the birds. I felt the sun on my face, and everything was fine. I didn't have anyone with me, but everything was fine. I realized that, for a long time, I associated loneliness with rejection, as if being alone meant I wasn't loved, that I wasn't important. But maybe loneliness was just that, being alone, without emotional baggage, without judgment. And maybe I could be alone and still be loved. I began to allow myself to feel longing without turning it into suffering, to miss my children without demanding their presence, to remember the moments we lived without expecting them to be repeated, because life isn't made of repetitions. It's made of cycles. And perhaps my cycle as a present, daily, necessary mother had already passed. And that wasn't sad. It was simply the truth. They had grown up. They had their own families, their own worries. And I could continue being a mother without having to be the center of everything. This understanding didn't come all at once. It came gradually, in small moments. Like when my son stopped by unexpectedly and brought me a loaf of bread he knew I liked. He didn't stay long. He had commitments. But he remembered me, and before I would have clung to that. I would have waited for him to come back soon. I would have sent thank you messages, trying to prolong that moment of connection. Butidi else let him go. And I realized that this didn't diminish the gesture. On the contrary, it made it more genuine. I also started noticing that when I stopped constantly seeking validation, some things began to happen more naturally. My daughter called me to ask for a recipe. My grandson tagged me in a funny video. Small things, but genuine. And I learned to value those little things without expecting them to turn into something bigger, without creating expectations that it meant a permanent change. They remained busy. I remained alone. But the dynamic was different because I was different. One afternoon, I found an old photo. Me, my husband, our young children, all smiling. And I looked at that image and felt gratitude, not sadness, not painful longing, just gratitude for having lived through that. And I understood that that phase had been beautiful, but it was over, and everything was fine. I started building a routine that was just for me. I woke up early. I made my coffee the way I liked it. I walked. I read. I watched my shows. And I no longer felt that weight of wasting time, that I should be doing something productive, something that justified my existence. I existed, and that was enough. I realized I had spent so much time trying to be needed that I had forgotten to be whole, trying to be the perfect mother, the present grandmother, the person who never fails, never disappoints, never gets tired. But I'm tired. And it was when I accepted this weariness, when I stopped fighting against it, that something began to change. Not externally. Nothing grand happened. My children didn't start visiting me every week. My grandchildren didn't start calling every day. But internally, something settled down. It was as if I had been carrying a heavy backpack for years and was finally allowed to put it down and breathe. One day, my neighbor, Marcia, invited me to go to the movies. It had been years since I'd gone. I thought it was strange at first. Going to the movies seemed like something for young people, for couples, for families. But I went, and it was good. Not because the film was extraordinary, but because I was doing something for myself, something that didn't depend on anyone, something that didn't need to be shared, posted, validated. I simply lived in that moment. And when we left, Marcia commented that she was happy I had accepted. She said she always saw me alone at home and that she was worried about me. I said I was fine, and it was true. She looked at me and smiled. You're different. I didn't know what to say, because I felt I was different, but I didn't know how to explain it. Lighter, she said, like you've stopped carrying something. And perhaps that was exactly it. I began to realize that my relationship with my children was changing, not because they had changed, but because I was allowing them to be who they were, without trying to mold them to my needs. And when I stopped expecting so much, they started showing up more often, not physically, but emotionally. The conversations became more genuine, less automatic, less formal. My daughter told me things she had never told me before. My son asked for advice he had never asked for before. And I realized that maybe, when I was desperate for attention, I wasn't leaving room for them to truly come, because they already knew what I was going to say, what I was going to do, how I was going to react. But now, there was space, there was silence, there was mystery, and that made them curious. I don't know if it was conscious on their part. Probably not. But I could feel the difference. And I learned that sometimes the best way to be found is to stop offering yourself all the time. One morning I woke up and realized I'd slept through the entire night without checking my phone. That might sound silly, but it meant a lot to me. Because for middle of the night, grab me phone and the nine. Just to make sure I hadn't missed anything, that no one had tried to contact me while I was sleeping, as if, even while sleeping, I needed to be available. But that morning, the cell phone was in the living room, far from me. and I had slept deeply, and the world continued as before. I started wondering how many other things I did on autopilot without questioning them. How many habits I had built around the fear of being forgotten, of not being enough, of not mattering. I realized I never made plans on my own. I always waited for someone to invite me, for someone to suggest something. And when no one suggested anything, I stayed home, waiting. But now, I was starting to do things differently. I made an appointment with the dentist that I had been putting off for months. I bought paint to paint the backyard fence. I called a distant cousin I hadn't seen in years just to chat, and each small action seemed to reinforce something inside me. Something that said, "You exist, even when no one is watching." One Saturday, my son said he was going to come over to my house. I was happy. Bytte steamed around it. I didn't rush to the supermarket. I didn't make a special meal. I didn't clean the house as if I were expecting a real guest. I just went on with my day. And when he arrived, everything was normal. The house was clean, but not spotless. There was coffee, but not a lavish spread. And you know what happened? Nothing. He didn't notice. He didn't comment. He just stayed there, chatted, had coffee, and left. And I realized that all that excessive preparation had never been for him. Itua formeux. It was my way of proving that I deserved the visit, that I was a good mother, that I still had value. But he didn't need proof. He just wanted to have coffee with me, and that was enough. I began to stay no frontem. They never asked me to always be available. They never asked me to drop everything for them. They never asked me to make their lives the center of mine. I was the one who did it. Because I thought that was how you loved. That was how you showed care. That was how you ensured I wouldn't be abandoned. But the fear of being abandoned made me abandon myself first. I had ceased to exist as an individual. I had become merely a function, mother, grandmother, the person who is always there. And when they didn't need that role, I felt invisible. But the truth is, I was always more than that. I'd just forgotten. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with an old notebook. I don't know why I picked it up. It had been stored away for years, and I started writing. Not a diary. Not deep thoughts, just loose things, memories, feelings, things I liked, things I wanted to do. And I realized that it had been so long since I'd thought about what I wanted that it was difficult at first. The words wouldn't come because I had spent so much time thinking about what others needed, what others wanted, that I no longer knew how to identify my own desires. But gradually, they began to appear. I wanted to travel. Not far, but I wanted to visit that small town my friend always talked about. I wanted to go to the beach off-season when it's empty and quiet. I wanted to learn how to do those fabric paintings I saw online. Small things, but mine. And I realized that I had never done any of that because I always thought I needed to be available, that I needed to be close. Tatif première left could be there, but nothing bad had happened, and I stayed close. I was just allowing close to have a different meaning. I spoke with Marcia about this. She said she understood perfectly. She said that when her children grew up and left home, she had a crisis. She felt she no longer had a purpose, that she didn't know who she was without them. "And what did you do?" I asked. She smiled. I had to get to know myself again, as if I had become young again, but at 60 years old. And I felt that was exactly what was happening to me. I was rediscovering myself, and it was frightening, but it was also liberating. I started making small changes to my routine. I would wake up and, instead of going straight to the kitchen, I would stay in bed for a few minutes, just enjoying the silence. Instead of automatically turning on the television, I would put on some music. Instead of cooking the same things as always, I would try new recipes, smalting, but they made a difference. And I realized I was starting to enjoy my own company. This was new to me because for so long, being alone meant loneliness. It meant rejection. It meant something was wrong. But now, being alone was just that, being alone. And sometimes it was even a good thing. One day my daughter called me, crying again, another problem with her husband. And I listened, as always. Beauty steamed where I was honest. I don't know, my daughter. I'm not part of your marriage. You're the one who knows. She remained silent. I think she expected me to offer a solution, to tell her what to do, like I always did. But I couldn't do that anymore, because I didn't know. And it was okay not to know. She hung up, a little frustrated, I could tell. But a few days later, she called me again. She said she had thought a lot about what I said, and that she had made a decision, her own decision, and that she was feeling good about it. And I realized that, by not giving her the answer immediately, I had given her something greater. I had given her space to find her own answer. And that strengthened her, and it set me free. I began to understand that being a mother wasn't about solving problems. It was about supporting others, and that required much less energy. And it was much more genuine. One afternoon, while tidying my closet, I found clothes I hadn't worn in years. Clothes I'd been saving for a special occasion. But that occasion never came. I put one on. A pretty blue blouse that I always thought was too elegant for everyday wear. And you know what I did. I went to the market with her. Nothing special. Just the market. But I looked good, and I felt good. And I realized I didn't need to wait for a special occasion. The occasion was now. It was about living. I started doing this with other things too. I used the nice dishes for a regular lunch. I lit candles at night, even when I was alone. I put flowers on the table, even when there were no guests. Because I deserved it. I didn't need an audience for that. There was one Sunday when I didn't touch my phone all day. Not on purpose. I just forgot. I was busy, painting the fence, listening to music, living. And when I finally picked it up that night, there were messages. My son asking if I was okay. My daughter saying she had tried to call. And for the first time, instead of feeling guilty, I felt something different. I felt that they had missed me. And that was good. It was healthy. Because it meant that I wasn't just a constant, invisible presence, taken for granted. I was someone who, when absent, was missed. I answered calmly. I said that everything was fine, that I had been busy all day. And nobody got angry. Nobody walked away. Life went on. Mais très tôt. I realized that the most profound change that was happening wasn't in my children, nor in the frequency of visits or phone calls. It was in how I felt about all of this. Before, every silence was a stab in the back. Every unanswered message was proof that I didn't matter. Every weekend alone was confirmation that I had failed as a mother. But now, silence was just silence. Unanswered messages simply meant busy people. Weekends alone were opportunities to do whatever I wanted. And this shift in perception changed everything. Not because reality had changed, but because I had changed. And as it changed, the way I experienced that reality also changed. I started noticing little things that had previously gone unnoticed, like how my son always brought bread when he came over, how my daughter always asked if I needed anything from the market, how my grandson, even without replying to my messages, always liked my photos. They were small gestures, but they were gestures. And I had spent so much time focused on what was missing that I had never appreciated what was there. That didn't mean I didn't miss them. It didn't mean I wouldn't want to see them again. But it meant I could miss things without suffering. I could want more without feeling empty. And that made all the difference. There was a moment, a few months later, when I was sitting on the balcony, drinking coffee, and I noticed something strange. I was at peace. It wasn't explosive happiness. It wasn't euphoria. It was just a quiet peace. A feeling that everything was all right, even though nothing had drastically changed around me. My children remained busy. My grandchildren remained distant. I continued living alone. But something fundamental had changed. And that something was me. I had stopped expecting life to give me something in return. I had stopped demanding that the people around me fill a void that only I could fill. And by stopping expecting, by stopping demanding, I realized that the void wasn't as big as I had imagined. In truth, it had been fueled by myself, by my fear, by my constant need for validation, by my inability to be with myself without feeling like something was missing. I remembered a conversation I had with Masha a few weeks ago. We were sitting at her house, having tea, when she said something that stuck with me. "You know what I've learned," she said, "that people come and go, not out of malice, just because that's how life is. And if we put all our peace in the hands of others, we'll never have peace because people are unpredictable. But we don't have to be." At the time, I heard it, but I didn't fully understand. Now, sitting there, alone, in peace, I understood. I didn't need my children to call every day to know I was loved. I didn't need constant visits to know I mattered. I didn't need external validation to exist. I existed, period, and that was enough. One day, my daughter stopped by unannounced. She was nearby, had some free time, and decided to drop by. And when she arrived, I was in the backyard, digging in the soil, planting some new seedlings. She watched me for a moment before speaking. "You seem happy, Mom." I looked at her, wiped my hands on my apron, and smiled. "I am fine." She sat on a small stool next to me and remained silent for a while. "Ten shuzel juridikflanet. But you are." I didn't say anything. I just kept digging in the dirt. She continued, "I always thought you needed me. That you felt bad when we didn't call, when we didn't visit. And I felt guilty. But at the same time, I felt suffocated, as if I was never enough, as if nothing I did was ever sufficient. That hurt. But it was true. And now?" I asked quietly. She thought for a moment. "Now, it seems you don't need me in that way. And that's good, because now, when I come, it's because I want to, not because I feel I need to. And that makes all the difference." She was right. I had spent so much time trying to hold my children close to me through guilt, through need, that I had never given them the chance to come of their own accord. And now that I had let them go, they were starting to come back. Not in the way I expected, not as often as I imagined, but in a more real way, more genuine. And that was better than any fantasy I had created in my head. I began to realize that, over these months, my relationship with time had also changed. Before, the days seemed endless. Every hour was a wait, waiting for a call, waiting for a message, waiting for some sign that I hadn't been forgotten. But now the days had rhythm, they had purpose, even if that purpose was just tending the garden, or reading a book, or walking through the square. I had learned to live in the present, and the present, inolo neli, iti full of small details, full of small pleasures. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of birds, the feeling of the sun on the skin, the satisfaction of finishing a simple task. These things have always been there. But I never paid attention because I was too busy waiting for something bigger, for something that would validate my existence. But life doesn't happen in the big moments. It happens in the small ones. And I had missed years of small moments because I was obsessed with the big ones. One night, I called my daughter. Not because I needed anything, not because I was feeling lonely, but simply because I had seen a recipe that I thought she would like. And the conversation was light. It was pleasant, without pressure, without expectations. And when I hung up, I realized that was what I had always wanted, genuine connection, without need, without desperation. And it had only been possible because I had stopped forcing it. I also began to notice that other things in my life had changed. My health, for example. I slept better. I ate better. I felt less pain in my body. As if the emotional weight I was carrying had manifested physically, and now, by letting it go, my body had also been freed. I had more energy, more drive, and I used that energy for myself, to do things that gave me pleasure. I enrolled in a fabric painting course that took place on Tuesdays at the community center. At first, I felt insecure. I thought I would be the oldest, that I wouldn't be able to keep up, that I would feel out of place. But that's not how it was. There were people of all ages, and they were all there for the same reason, because they wanted to learn something new, because they wanted to do something for themselves. And for the first time in a long time, I felt part of something that had nothing to do with being a mother or a grandmother or a widow. I was just me, a woman learning to paint flowers on dish towels, and that was good. I became friends with one of the women in the course. Her name was Helena. She was 65 years old, divorced, and had lived alone for 10 years. And she had a lightness that I admired. I once asked her how she dealt with loneliness. Sherloged, loneliness. I love being alone. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. That's not loneliness. That's freedom. And that stuck with me. Because I had spent my whole life seeing loneliness as a punishment, as something to be avoided at all costs. But maybe it could be something else. Maybe it could be an opportunity. I started to see my house differently. Before, every empty room was a reminder that I was alone. Now, every room was mine, to do whatever I wanted. I transformed the room into a welcoming space full of plants and cushions. I placed my favorite chair near the window where the afternoon light streamed in. I created a reading nook. Asiwi nook, the place to wait. It has become a place to live. There was one Sunday when I woke up and, for the first time in years, I didn't feel that tightness in my chest. I didn't feel that silent anguish that it would be another day alone, another Sunday without family, another lush for jeune premier jour au cap. I made my coffee, I put on some music, and I stayed there, dancing alone in the kitchen, while I baked a cake, and you feel full. Not because something extraordinary had happened, but because I was okay with myself, and that was extraordinary enough. My son stopped by that afternoon without warning. And when he came in, he smelled the cake and smiled. Did you bake a cake? I made it. Want a piece. We sat together. Talked about simple things, about his work, about the weather, about nothing in particular. And it was good. He was gone for less than an hour. He had to pick up the children somewhere. And when he left, I didn't feel that emptiness from before. That feeling that he had taken something from me when he left. I just went back to my routine, to my Sunday, to my peace. And I realized that was the secret. Not to expect the presence of others to complete me. Because I was already complete. They could add to my life. They could bring joy. They could bring connection. But I didn't need them to exist, to be valid. To have valued and loved them. On the contrary, I loved them even more now. Because this love didn't come from neediness. It came from choice. I chose to love them. Even when they were distant. Even when they didn't call. Even when I wasn't a priority. And by making that choice, I freed myself. Because love ceased to be a prison and became a gift. There was an afternoon when I was organizing some old photos. I had hundreds of them, from when my children were little, from when my husband was alive, from when the house was full of noise and life, and I looked at those photos fondly, but without sadness, because I understood now that those memories were beautiful, but they were the past, and the past doesn't come back. No matter how much we want it to, no matter how much we insist. But the present is here, now, and the present can also be beautiful, just in a different way. I carefully stored the photos, and I returned to my afternoon, to my gift. One day I received a call from an unknown number. It was a phone company offering a new plan. Before, I would have gotten angry. I would have hung up on them. Butitim politely said I thanked them. And when I hung up, I laughed to myself. Because even that seemed different. Not even a telemarketing call had the power to throw me off balance. I was strong. I was whole. I was okay. I started noticing that my daughter was calling more often. Not every day, but more frequently, and the connections were different. They were lighter, more genuine. She shared things with me, not just problems, but joys too, small victories, small discoveries. And I just listened, without trying to solve anything, without trying to teach, just sharing that moment with her. And it was beautiful. My son started coming to the house more often, too. He didn't stay long, but he came, and he always brought something. Bread, fruit, some random little thing. And I understood now that that was his way of saying I love you, not with words, not with grand gestures, but with small things. And that was enough. My grandchildren started inviting me to play something online. I didn't understand any of it, but they were tomme. They laughed at my clumsiness. And they were simple moments, but they were ours. And I realized that the connection I had been searching for had always been there. It just needed space to emerge. And I had spent so much time suffocating that space with my expectations, with my demands, that I had never allowed it to flourish. But now, she was blossoming, in her own way, in her own time. And I was learning to appreciate that. One night I was lying in bed, about to fall asleep, and I found myself thinking about everything that had changed. And I realized that the biggest change hadn't been in the external circumstances. The biggest change had been internal. I had changed the way I saw myself, the way I treated myself, the way I existed in the world. Before, I was a shadow, a presence that was only justified through others, through what I could do for them, through my constant availability. But now I was whole, even alone, even without an audience, even without validation. And that feeling of wholeness was something no one could take away from me because it didn't depend on anyone. It was mine. I got out of bed and went to the living room. My cell phone was on the table, face down. I picked it up. I looked at the screen. There were no new messages. There were no notifications. Enfin, premier puits de back to bed. And I slept deeply, without anguish. Oui, toute fière, without just in peace. In the following days, I continued my routine. I continued living. I continued existing. Not for anyone else, but for myself. And things kept happening around me. My children kept calling. My grandchildren kept showing up, even if only virtually. Life went on. But now I was present in it, truly present, not expecting anything to happen, but living through what was happening, and that made all the difference. One morning I woke up and felt like calling my daughter, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, and I called. We talked for a few minutes. She was in traffic, on her way to work, but she was happy with the call. And when we hung up, I didn't wait for her to call back. I didn't analyze every word. I didn't create any expectations. I just went on with my day. And I realized that this was freedom, not needing immediate feedback, not needing constant confirmation. Juste live and let others live too. I began to understand that true love doesn't hold on, it liberates. And for so long, I thought that love meant holding on. It meant always being present. It meant never letting go. But to love is to trust. It's to let go. It's to allow the other person to exist fully, even when they are far from you. And by allowing that, something curious happened. They're back, not because I forced them, not because I demanded it, but because somehow, when I stopped pushing, they've ontek amidir in their own time. And that was more than enough. One day I was in the square, sitting on a bench, watching the people, when a woman sat down next to me. She seemed tired, sad. We were silent for a while, until she spoke. Sorry to bother you, but you seem to be at peace. I looked at her and smiled. I am. She sighed. I don't know how to get there. I feel so alone. My children never call. They never visit. And I don't know what to do. I recognized that pain because it had been mine. And for the first time, I had something to say, not advice, not a solution, but an experience. I felt the same way. I said, but I realized that the longer I waited for them, the more alone I became. Not because they abandoned me, but because I had abandoned myself first. She looked at me, confused. Première continued. I spent so much time waiting for them to fill my void that I forgot the void was mine, and that only I could fill it. She remained silent, processing. And how did you do that? She asked, little by little, one day at a time. Stop waiting. Start living. I don't know if that helped her, but she thanked them. And je lève. And I sat there, realizing that perhaps this was the most important lesson of all. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It happens now. And we can spend our whole lives waiting for others. Or we can start living, even alone, even without applause, even without witnesses, because life doesn't need an audience. It only needs courage. I returned home that day with a strange feeling, a feeling of completeness, of a closed cycle. Not because everything was perfect, not because I had all the answers, but Because, for the first time in a long time, I was at peace with what I didn't have, with what I didn't know, with what I couldn't control. And that peace was more valuable than any certainty. I sat on the porch. I got my coffee. I looked at the sky, and she smiled because I was fine, truly fine, and that didn't depend on anyone else, just from me. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing that you're not alone.